There is a place in Afghanistan where the wind howls down from the Hindu Kush at 3 in the morning, where the temperature drops 40 degrees in 4 hours, where the nearest paved road is a 2-day drive, and where a group of American soldiers woke up every single morning knowing that the mountain ridge above them might be hiding men who wanted them dead. They lived there, not for a week, not for a month, sometimes for an entire year without leaving the wire. They built their home out of sandbags and plywood and sheer willpower. They cooked food on burners powered by fuel that had to be flown in by helicopter. They slept in beds they made themselves. They showered maybe once a week if the water supply held, and they fought. Every single day they fought. This is the story of the American fire base in Afghanistan, not the big bases, not Bagram Airfield with its pizza shops and its gyms and its movie nights, the small ones. The tiny combat outposts and forward operating bases carved into the most violent, remote, unforgiving terrain on the planet. The places where surviving was not a figure of speech, it was the daily mission. And what those soldiers ate, how they slept, what they drank, how they stayed warm, how they stayed sane, how they kept fighting when everything around them was actively trying to kill them, that story deserves to be told in full. If you have respect for the men and women who served this country in those mountains, type fire base in the comments right now. And before we go any further, please take a second to subscribe. Over 98% of viewers watch without subscribing. It costs you nothing but means everything to us. Now let us go back to those mountains. Afghanistan is not what most people picture when they think of a war zone. They think of desert, flat sand, burning heat, open roads. Afghanistan is something else entirely. The eastern part of the country, particularly Kunar province, Nuristan, the Korangal Valley, the Pech River Valley, Wardakh, Lagar, parts of Khost and Paksha, these places are mountainous in a way that redefines the word. The peaks reach above 15,000 feet. The valleys are so narrow that a man standing at the bottom can reach out and almost touch both walls. The trails are carved by feet and hooves over centuries, too steep and too narrow for any vehicle. There are villages in Afghanistan that have never seen a car. The terrain itself was a weapon, used by the Taliban and by Al-Qaeda long before the first American boot touched Afghan soil, and used against American forces every single day of the war. The Soviet Union learned that lesson. British colonial forces learned it before them. Alexander the Great learned it more than 2,000 years ago. And in the fall of 2001, American forces began learning it again. The decision to place combat outposts and fire bases deep in these valleys and on these ridgelines was strategic. You cannot control terrain you do not occupy. You cannot protect the population if your forces are sitting 50 miles away on a large base. The theory of counterinsurgency demanded presence. It demanded that American soldiers live among the people, patrol the villages, build relationships, and make themselves a permanent fixture in the landscape. What that theory did not fully account for was what it would cost in terms of daily human endurance to actually do that. Because surviving on a remote fire base in Afghanistan was not a background activity. It was itself a full-time job running alongside the actual combat mission, and both had to be done simultaneously, every single day, no matter the weather, no matter the casualties, no matter how exhausted everyone was. Let us start at the very beginning. How did these bases even get built? Because they did not arrive pre-assembled. They were constructed by the soldiers who would live and fight in them, often under fire, in terrain that made every single task 3 times harder than it would have been anywhere else on Earth. When a unit was tasked with establishing a new combat outpost, they were typically inserted by helicopter into a location that had already been chosen by planners who had studied aerial imagery, intelligence reports, and topographic maps. What looked manageable on a map often looked like something else entirely when you were standing in it. The first thing soldiers did after establishing a security perimeter was start building, and the primary building material was sand. More specifically, sand and sandbags. A combat outpost might require tens of thousands of sandbags to build its basic defensive walls. Each sandbag had to be filled by hand, tied off, and stacked. In the heat of an Afghan summer, filling sandbags at altitude in body armor is a punishing physical task. In the cold of an Afghan winter, the sand freezes and the bags turn into blocks. Either way, it got done. The layout of a fire base was not random. Defensive positions called fighting positions or gun positions were placed to maximize fields of fire in every direction. Observation posts were established on higher ground when possible, though in many valleys the enemy occupied higher ground and the Americans had to make do. The interior of the base was organized around a few key structures: the command post, the medical station, the ammunition point, and the living quarters. Living quarters is a generous term. In the early days of a new outpost, living quarters meant whatever shelter could be improvised from materials on hand. Tents, poncho liners strung between posts, sections of the defensive wall itself. As a base matured, the soldiers built more permanent structures using timber, plywood, corrugated metal, and anything else that could be flown in or scavenged locally. Some of the longer established outposts in places like the Korangal Valley developed into surprisingly organized little settlements with named buildings, rough streets, even a degree of institutional character. But they were still fundamentally primitive, fundamentally exposed, and fundamentally dangerous. Now let us talk about sleep, because the question of how soldiers slept on these fire bases is not simple, and the answer reveals a great deal about what sustained combat does to the human body and the human mind. Sleep on a remote fire base in Afghanistan was not a luxury. It was a tactical requirement. A soldier who has not slept cannot shoot accurately, cannot make sound decisions, cannot react quickly enough when the first round comes in. Unit leadership understood this. Getting sleep was part of the mission preparation, not separate from it. The problem was that sleep was also the thing the enemy most aggressively tried to deny. The Taliban were sophisticated adversaries who understood the value of disruption. Night attacks, harassing fire, the sound of a single rifle shot in the dark. All of it served the purpose of keeping American soldiers awake, keeping them on the walls, keeping them in their body armor when what they needed was rest. The response was a rotation system. Guard shifts, called pulls or watches depending on the unit, were structured around ensuring that some portion of the force was always alert and on the walls while others got rest. A typical rotation might be 2 hours on, 4 hours off, though the exact schedule varied by unit size, threat level, and operational tempo. In practice, those 4 hours off were not always 4 full hours of sleep. Maintenance tasks, briefings, equipment checks, medical duties, all of those things happened in the off-shift window. A soldier might realistically get 3 hours of actual sleep before the rotation came back around. Do that for days, then weeks, then months. The cumulative effect is a kind of sustained cognitive degradation that soldiers who served in these places describe with remarkable consistency. You function, you do your job, but there is a fog that settles over everything. The brain adapts to a chronic sleep deficit by changing its priorities, and those changes have real consequences that last long after the deployment ends. Where soldiers slept was itself a study in improvisation. The first generation of structures on most combat outposts were basic wooden frames covered with plywood and surrounded by sandbags, called hooches or bee-huts depending on the region. Inside these structures, soldiers slept on metal cots with whatever padding they could accumulate, sleeping bags rated for cold weather temperatures if the supply system had provided them, extra uniform layers thrown on top for warmth if it had not. In winter, temperatures inside these structures could drop below freezing. Small kerosene heaters or diesel burning units called Herman Nelson heaters were used when available. But fuel was always a concern because every gallon of fuel on a remote fire base had to be flown in by helicopter, and helicopter resupply was always subject to weather, threat levels, and operational priorities. There were outposts that went without resupply for stretches of 10, 12, 14 days. On those days, every consumable item, fuel, food, water, batteries, became something to be rationed and managed with care. The sleeping structures on a well-established outpost were often named by the soldiers who built them. Informal names drawn from inside jokes, hometown references, fallen comrades. Those names became part of the social fabric of the place, a way of creating ownership and familiarity in an environment that was fundamentally inhospitable. The act of naming your living space, of claiming a corner of a wooden box in a valley in Afghanistan as your place, was a small but real act of psychological resistance against the chaos and danger that surrounded it every hour of every day. Now let us go deeper into the question of food. Because food on a remote fire base was not just about nutrition. It was about morale, about routine, about the human need to have something to look forward to in an environment stripped of most normal pleasures. The primary food source for soldiers on remote combat outposts was the meal, ready to eat, universally known as the MRE. The MRE is a self-contained field ration designed to provide approximately 1,200 calories per meal with a shelf life of 3 to 5 years in normal storage conditions. Each MRE contains a main entree, a side dish, crackers or bread, a spread such as peanut butter or cheese, a dessert, a beverage powder, seasonings, utensils, and a flameless ration heater. The flameless ration heater is one of those pieces of military technology that seems minor until you're sitting on a mountain in Afghanistan in November, and it is the only thing standing between you and eating cold chicken and noodles in the dark. It works through a chemical reaction that generates heat when water is added. You slide the main entree pouch into the heater, add a small amount of water, fold the top over, and within 10 to 15 minutes you have a meal that is genuinely hot. It is not a gourmet experience, but it is hot, and on a cold night at altitude, hot food is not a small thing, it is a foundational thing. The MRE menu has changed significantly over the decades of the Afghanistan conflict. By the mid-2000s, there were more than 24 different menu options, ranging from beef stew to chicken fajitas to a vegetarian option that soldiers referred to with varying degrees of affection and its opposite. Over time, certain menu items developed almost cult-like status among the force. The peanut butter was considered universally valuable and frequently traded. The jalapeno cheese spread had its dedicated partisans. The chili with macaroni, sometimes called chili mac, was widely regarded as one of the better options. The country captain chicken was widely regarded as something else. The MRE trading economy on a fire base was a real and functioning social institution. Soldiers would trade components of their rations the way a financial market trades commodities. The currency of value was determined by individual preference, caloric need, and a collective unit culture around what was good and what was tolerable. A soldier who happened to receive the more sought-after items in their rations had a genuine social resource to work with. There is something quietly human about that. In the middle of a combat deployment in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, men were still negotiating over peanut butter. But MREs were not the only food source on established fire bases. As outposts matured and the supply chain became more reliable, additional food resources began to flow in. Thermite containers, called mermites by the soldiers who handled them, could keep hot food warm during transport and were sometimes used to deliver hot chow cooked at a larger base to smaller outposts. The catch was that mermite delivery required helicopter access, and helicopter access was never guaranteed. On a bad week, a fire base might go several days without hot food from the rear. Some combat outposts had their own improvised kitchens. A flat surface, a fuel burner, whatever food had come in on the last resupply. The quality of these improvised cooking setups varied enormously by unit and by the individual skills of whoever ended up cooking. Some soldiers had civilian backgrounds in food service and applied those skills to making field rations more edible. Some units kept stocks of hot sauce, spice packets, ramen noodles, and other non-perishable supplements that arrived in care packages from home. The care package was one of the great lifelines of the fire base experience. Family members, churches, civic organizations, strangers who found a unit's address through a support organization, all of them sent boxes packed with things that were not available through the military supply chain. Beef jerky, hard candy, instant coffee, energy drink mix, wet wipes, foot powder, books, playing cards, phone charger cables, hand warmers. Every single one of those items had value that went beyond its practical function. A care package from home was evidence that somewhere, far from the mountains and the wire and the watch rotations, people knew you were there and were thinking about you. That psychological function was not trivial. It was, for many soldiers, a genuine anchor to the world they were fighting to return to. The soldiers on remote fire bases also supplemented their diet through local relationships when they were able to. Afghan villages near outposts sometimes became sources of fresh bread, locally grown vegetables, and occasionally the components for what might loosely be called a local meal. The relationship between a fire base and the surrounding village was always complex, always layered with security considerations, but it was also human. Afghan villagers and American soldiers occasionally shared food across cultural divides that could not be easily bridged in any other way. A cup of chai, the ubiquitous sweet green tea served across Afghanistan, was offered and accepted thousands of times across thousands of meetings between American forces and local populations. That small ritual, sitting together with something hot to drink, carried meaning that transcended the language barrier. It was recognition of shared humanity in a place that was trying hard to deny it. Water was a constant operational concern on remote fire bases. The human body requires a minimum of 1 to 2 quarts of water per day under resting conditions. A soldier in body armor moving through high-altitude mountainous terrain on a combat patrol requires significantly more, sometimes up to 6 quarts or more depending on temperature and exertion level. Dehydration at altitude is faster and more dangerous than at sea level, and the consequences of dehydration during a firefight are severe. Water on remote outposts arrived through several channels. Bottled water flown in on helicopter resupply was the primary source for drinking and cooking. Some outposts had access to local water sources, streams or springs fed by snowmelt, which could be treated using purification tablets or portable filtration systems. The military fielded several generations of water purification equipment during the Afghanistan War, ranging from individual-use tablets to unit-level purification units capable of processing hundreds of gallons per day. The discipline around water rationing was real and enforced. Leaders at every level understood that losing soldiers to heat casualties or dehydration was a failure of basic logistics management, and the stigma of that failure was motivation enough to keep the water discipline tight even when the supply chain was stressed. Let us talk now about what happened when the mortars started, because no account of life on an Afghan fire base is complete without a full accounting of what it meant to be a target. Remote fire bases in contested terrain were not just bases that happened to be near fighting, they were fighting positions. The act of sitting in the valley was itself a provocation to the enemy, and the enemy responded with consistency and creativity. The mortar was one of the most commonly used weapons against American fire bases throughout the Afghanistan War. It is a simple weapon, a tube and a shell, but in the hands of experienced operators in familiar terrain it can be devastatingly accurate. Taliban mortar teams often pre-surveyed their firing positions, working out the exact calculations for hitting specific points inside American bases, and then rehearsing the attacks until they could set up, fire multiple rounds, and break down in under 2 minutes before American counter-battery fire could be brought to bear. The first sound of an incoming mortar is the distinctive crack and thump of the round leaving its tube, audible from a distance if you know what to listen for. The next sound is the whistle of the round in flight growing louder as it closes, then the explosion. Experienced soldiers on fire bases could often tell from the sound of the launch how close the incoming round was likely to land. That knowledge did not make it less terrifying, but it did enable a rational response. Into the bunker, down behind the wall, into the fighting position, the behavior became reflexive. The base alarm might be a siren, a voice over a radio, a simple shout of incoming that traveled down the line at a sprint. Everyone had a job when the mortars started. Those on the walls tracked for any follow-on ground assault. The medic prepared for casualties. The mortar teams found their own tubes and began calculating counter-battery solutions. The radio operator reached out to hire for fire support options, attack aviation, field artillery, whatever was available and in range. The actions were practiced, rehearsed, and internalized to the point where they happened before conscious thought could catch up. That internalization was the product of training, but also of repetition. Soldiers on fire bases that took regular contact became proficient in their roles in the way that any person becomes proficient through repeated practice. The difference was that the stakes of getting it wrong were permanent. Rocket attacks followed a similar pattern. Improvised rocket systems using 107mm rockets, 122mm rockets, and improvised variations were commonly used against fire bases throughout the war. These weapons had longer range than mortars and were inherently less accurate, but an inaccurate weapon is still a lethal one when it lands close enough. Direct fire attacks, actual small arms and machine gun fire against the base perimeter, were a different experience. The sound of incoming fire, the sharp crack of rounds passing overhead, is viscerally different from indirect fire. There is something about knowing that a person is pointing a weapon directly at you that activates a response that no amount of training fully domesticates. It is controlled, it is channeled into action, but it is real. Soldiers who describe their first direct fire contact consistently report a physical clarity, a hyper-awareness of immediate surroundings, a collapsing of attention onto the task directly in front of them. Everything narrows, the rest of the world disappears. There's only the wall, the weapon, the sector of fire, and what is moving in it. The aftermath of a contact was its own distinct phase of the fire base experience. The immediate tasks, accountability of all personnel, assessment of casualties, ammunition resupply to the fighting positions, medical treatment, situation reports up the chain of command. Once the immediate tasks were done and the threat had been suppressed or withdrawn, a quieter process began. Soldiers checked on each other. Leaders moved through the positions asking questions, not always tactical questions, sometimes just being present. The debriefs happened. What went right? What went wrong? What needed to change? That systematic learning process was one of the quiet competencies of the American small unit at war. The willingness to sit down after a contact, often still in body armor, often still running on adrenaline, and work through exactly what had happened and why, was part of what kept units alive over the course of a deployment. The physical environment of an Afghan fire base was its own persistent challenge entirely separate from the enemy. The altitude was the first and most persistent factor. Many combat outposts in eastern Afghanistan were located between 6,000 and 9,000 feet above sea level. Some observation posts and temporary positions went higher. At those altitudes, the air contains significantly less oxygen than at sea level, and the human body takes weeks to fully acclimatize. New soldiers arriving at altitude often experienced headaches, fatigue, reduced aerobic capacity, and disturbed sleep as their bodies adjusted. Running at altitude is harder. Carrying weight at altitude is harder. Fighting at altitude is harder. The enemy fighters who lived in these mountains their entire lives had a natural advantage. They were acclimated. They knew the terrain. They could move on routes that American soldiers with their body armor and equipment could barely navigate. The temperature range at altitude in Afghanistan was extreme by almost any standard. Summer days at high elevation could exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit with intense solar radiation and low humidity that dehydrated the body faster than the sensation of thirst could track. Winter nights at the same elevation regularly fell to 0 degrees Fahrenheit and below. Wind in the mountains accelerated both heat loss in winter and dehydration in summer. The transition seasons, the brief spring and the briefer fall, were among the most tactically active periods of the war because the high mountain passes became passable for enemy movement just as the weather made operations more physically manageable. Winter on a high-altitude fire base was its own particular ordeal. The combination of cold, reduced helicopter access due to weather, and the psychological weight of months at an isolated outpost created conditions that demanded everything from unit cohesion and individual resilience. Fuel for heating was a constant concern. Generators, the lifeblood of the base for communications, medical equipment, and lighting, consumed fuel continuously, and their maintenance was an ongoing priority. A generator that failed in winter at altitude was not an inconvenience. It was a potential emergency. The soldiers assigned as mechanics and maintenance personnel on these outposts were not glamorous figures in the popular image of the Afghanistan war, but they were foundational ones. The man who could keep a generator running in -10-degree temperatures with improvised parts and a manual that may or may not have been current was keeping his entire base operational. The dust of Afghanistan was another constant companion. The fine powder that covered the floors of Afghan valleys was not dirt in any familiar sense. It was an ultrafine particulate that infiltrated everything. Weapon mechanisms, electronic equipment, lungs, eyes, food preparation surfaces. The dust got into MREs, it got into sleeping bags, it got into wounds and complicated their treatment. Soldiers developed a relationship with that dust that went from frustration to grim resignation. You cleaned your weapon constantly. You cleaned it in the morning and in the evening and after every patrol and after every contact. The maintenance of personal weapon systems on a fire base was a non-negotiable daily ritual because a weapon that failed at the wrong moment was a direct and immediate threat to survival. The dust also contributed to respiratory illness, a fact that has become increasingly documented in the years since the war. The burn pits that many fire bases use to dispose of waste, burning everything from trash to medical waste to ammunition packaging to human waste in open pits with jet fuel as an accelerant, added another layer of airborne contamination to the environment. The long-term health consequences of burn pit exposure became one of the significant veterans' health issues of the post-war period, and the relationship between those fires and the chronic respiratory conditions that many veterans developed is now better documented than it was during the years of the conflict itself. Hygiene and sanitation on a remote fire base deserves its own detailed account, because it was a medical, operational, and morale issue simultaneously. The baseline sanitation infrastructure on most combat outposts was primitive. Latrines were typically wooden structures placed over burn or burial pits, or over cut-off 50-gallon drums that were periodically burned out with diesel fuel. The phrase "burning the shitters" was used without irony or embarrassment across every generation of soldiers who served on these bases, because it was simply what had to be done to manage human waste in a location with no sewage infrastructure. The soldier assigned that particular duty in the rotation learned quickly that the trick was patience and the right fuel mixture. Bathing was a luxury rationed by the reality of the water supply. A fire base with reliable water resupply might afford its soldiers a brief shower every few days. The shower facility on most outposts was improvised. A wooden enclosure, a bag shower fed by gravity from a water bladder elevated above head height, a drain cut into the ground. The water was cold unless sunlight had warmed the bladder, which in summer it often had, and in winter it very much had not. A cold shower at altitude in an Afghan winter required a degree of personal commitment that most people will never be asked to demonstrate in their daily lives. Soldiers improvised alternatives. Baby wipes, which arrived by the case in care packages and on resupply runs, became one of the most valuable commodities on a fire base. The military field sanitation protocol describes a sponge bath with minimal water. In practice, a packet of wet wipes became the primary hygiene tool for many soldiers on days when a proper shower was not possible. This was not a failure of the system. This was the system. Field conditions require field solutions, and the soldiers who adapted to those conditions did so with a matter-of-fact practicality that is one of the defining characteristics of the American infantrymen at war. Dental hygiene, skin care, foot care, these were not vanities. They were operational necessities. A foot infection at altitude far from a medical facility could take a soldier off the line in a way that a clean pair of dry socks and 10 minutes of daily foot inspection could have prevented. The senior NCOs who emphasized these basics and enforced them through the unit culture were not being pedantic. They were keeping their people healthy and mission capable. The medical infrastructure on a remote fire base typically consisted of one or more medics, formerly called 68 Whiskies under the Army's military occupational specialty system, with varying levels of additional training depending on the unit and the time period of the deployment. In Ranger units, special forces, and other elite formations, the medics had more extensive training. In conventional infantry units on remote outposts, the standard medic was trained in trauma care, basic emergency medicine, and the management of common field illnesses, and was typically the most medically capable person on the base. When a soldier was badly wounded in a firefight, the medic's first response in the first minutes was often the difference between life and death. The evacuation of casualties from remote fire bases was one of the most challenging and costly aspects of the Afghanistan war. Medical evacuation helicopters, medevac birds, had to navigate extreme terrain, enemy fire, weather, altitude, and darkness to reach wounded soldiers. The pilots who flew those missions are among the unheralded heroes of the conflict, making decisions in degraded conditions that required simultaneous mastery of the machine, the terrain, and the tactical situation on the ground below them. The golden hour, the medical principle that a seriously wounded patient has the best chance of survival if they can reach surgical care within 60 minutes of injury, was aspirational on many remote fire bases. The terrain and the distance made 60 minutes impossible in many cases. The medic on the ground knew this. His job was to keep his patient alive long enough for the helicopter to arrive, however long that took. He did it with training, improvisation, sheer physical effort, and sometimes with nothing more than the refusal to accept that the man in front of him was going to die. Let us talk about the social world of the fire base. Because human beings are social creatures, and they do not stop being social creatures because they are living on a fortified hilltop in Afghanistan with people actively trying to kill them. In fact, the social dynamics of a small combat unit on a remote fire base are intensified by the conditions, not diminished. Relationships formed between soldiers on these outposts were built under a kind of pressure that civilian relationships rarely face. When you have shared physical hardship, shared danger, shared deprivation, shared fear, and shared purpose over the course of months, the bonds that form are not ordinary ones. Veterans consistently describe their combat teammates as the people they have ever been closest to in their lives, including in many cases their own families. This is not a sentimental exaggeration. It is a documented psychological reality. The shared experience of extreme conditions creates attachments that are qualitatively different from normal social bonds. It also creates dynamics that require skilled leadership to manage. The flip side of intense bonding is intense friction. Small unit dynamics on a fire base were not always harmonious. Living in extremely close quarters with the same small group of people, under constant stress, with limited resources, no privacy, and no escape, generates interpersonal tensions that in any other context would be resolved by simply leaving the room. On a fire base, there is no room to leave to. The senior NCOs and officers on these outposts spent a significant portion of their leadership energy managing the human dynamics of the unit alongside the tactical and logistical demands of the mission. Squad leader who could diffuse a tension between two soldiers before it became a problem, who could recognize that a particular soldier was approaching the limit of what he could sustain, and route him toward a task that would give him a brief psychological break, who could maintain morale not through speeches but through small daily acts of genuine attention to his people. That man was worth his weight in gold. Humor was the great social currency of the fire base. The darker and more specific the humor, the better. Soldiers made jokes about things that would horrify outsiders precisely because the ability to laugh at the fear, the discomfort, the randomness of the danger was a survival mechanism. It was a way of asserting psychological control over circumstances that otherwise exerted complete control over you. The humor that emerged from combat deployments was sometimes misunderstood by people outside that world as callousness or worse. It was neither. It was a sophisticated coping mechanism, culturally transmitted through the unit, and it served a real psychological function in maintaining the mental health of men under sustained stress. Entertainment on a fire base in Afghanistan evolved significantly across the course of the war. In the early years of the conflict, soldiers made do with decks of cards, personal books, and whatever music they had managed to load onto personal devices before deploying. The introduction of cheap personal media players and laptops changed the entertainment landscape on fire bases significantly. By the mid-2000s, most soldiers had some form of digital media available. Movies, TV shows, music libraries, video games, small portable gaming systems arrived in care packages. Soldiers shared hard drives loaded with seasons of television shows. The shared experience of watching a favorite series together in a small wooden structure on a fire base in Afghanistan, while the wind howled outside, became a genuine touchstone of the deployment experience for an entire generation of veterans. There is something profoundly human about that image. A group of armed men in body armor, sitting on cots in a plywood box 7,000 feet above sea level in the middle of a war, watching episodes of a television show, and arguing about the plot. It is not what you expect from the imagery of war, but it is what war actually looked like on the inside. Letters and mail from home were another vital social resource. The military postal system worked hard to get mail to even the most remote outposts, though delivery was inevitably irregular. A mail call on a fire base was a significant social event. Soldiers who received letters or packages shared freely with those who received nothing, because the unit culture demanded it and because the morale of every person in the unit mattered to the survival of all of them. A soldier who was significantly depressed, significantly distracted, significantly checked out from the team was a safety risk to everyone around him. Keeping that soldier connected to home and to the team was not a soft concern. It was a hard tactical one. The leaders on these fire bases bore a particular kind of weight that is worth examining closely. The company commanders, typically captains in their late 20s or early 30s, who commanded the soldiers on these outposts were making decisions with life and death stakes on a daily basis. They were doing so in ambiguous environments with imperfect intelligence, under rules of engagement that were constantly evolving, in coordination with coalition partners whose capabilities and priorities varied, and in the context of relationships with local Afghan authorities and populations that were complex and never fully transparent. The platoon leaders, typically first or second lieutenants fresh from officer candidate school or West Point or ROTC, were in many cases leading combat operations at 22 and 23 years of age, with a level of autonomy and responsibility that corporate executives twice their age would find staggering. They made call-for-fire requests that directed artillery rounds and airstrikes onto specific coordinates. They made decisions on patrol about whether to push forward or pull back based on their read of the terrain and the situation. They wrote casualty reports and sat with their platoon sergeant to figure out what to say to the rest of the platoon when one of their soldiers did not come back from the patrol. The platoon sergeants, typically in their mid-30s with a decade or more of experience, were the institutional backbone of the small unit. They had been junior soldiers and junior NCOs before they were platoon sergeants. They had seen bad decisions at higher levels. They had seen good ones. They had the experience base to know the difference and the authority structure that allowed them to counsel their lieutenant when counsel was needed. The relationship between a platoon leader and his platoon sergeant on a fire base was one of the most important professional relationships in the United States Army, and the quality of that relationship had direct consequences for the soldiers in their charge. The senior NCOs, the first sergeants and sergeant majors, managed the human dimension of the fight at every level. They knew which soldiers were struggling. They knew which soldiers were carrying more than their share. They knew which leaders needed encouragement and which ones needed correction. And they acted on that knowledge continuously in small ways and large, informal settings and in quiet conversations at the edge of the wire before dawn. Let us come back now to what soldiers ate in more detail, because the food story on a fire base goes deeper than MREs and care packages. It goes to what food meant in that context as something beyond nutrition. On well-established fire bases that had been operating long enough to develop some logistic stability, units sometimes received access to a containerized kitchen system, a military field kitchen that could be assembled from a shipping container, and produce hot meals for the unit. When this happened, it was genuinely transformative. Hot food cooked from something other than a plastic pouch, served in something resembling a normal meal, eaten in the company of the entire unit rather than in isolated fighting positions, was a social and morale event as much as it was a nutritional one. The cook, whatever his formal military job title might have been, was briefly one of the most popular people on the fire base. Some units had soldiers with formal culinary training or natural cooking ability who managed to produce remarkable results from the limited resources available. Field expedients for improving food quality were shared knowledge across the force. Ramen noodles crushed and combined with MRE components created dishes with more texture and variety than the original rations alone. Hot sauce, which arrived in enormous quantities through the supply chain and in care packages, was used to improve almost everything. The military's Tabasco sauce packet, included in MREs for decades, achieved a kind of iconic status as the universal improver. The communal meal, wherever it happened and with whatever resources were available, was one of the few moments in the fire base day that was not primarily defined by the mission. It was a pause. A moment of something resembling normal human social behavior. Sitting together, eating together, talking about something other than the patrol or the threat or the next rotation. Those moments mattered. They mattered for reasons that are easy to understand intellectually and impossible to fully communicate to anyone who was not there. The question of how soldiers maintain their mental health on remote fire bases is one that the military has grappled with openly and seriously since the beginning of the Afghanistan war, and one that continues to shape how the institution thinks about care for its people. The exposure to sustained combat stress on a remote outpost is categorically different from the combat stress experienced on a larger base or in a rear area. On a large base, a soldier can sometimes walk away from the operational environment for a few hours. He can go to the gym, he can call home, he can sit somewhere that is not a fighting position and decompress for a moment. On a remote fire base, there is no walking away. The operational environment is everywhere all the time. The wire is visible from every point inside the base. The mountains are always there, always potentially full of the enemy, always watching. The psychological literature on combat stress identifies several factors that either protect against or increase the risk of stress-related injury. Unit cohesion is one of the most powerful protective factors. The sense that the people around you will not let you down, that you share their commitment and they share yours, creates a psychological buffer against the most corrosive effects of sustained fear and hardship. The fire base, with its isolation and its intensity, was in some ways a perfect environment for building that cohesion. And in other ways, when units struggled with leadership failures or interpersonal breakdowns, it was an environment where the absence of cohesion was catastrophic. Leadership behavior had a direct and documented effect on unit stress levels. Leaders who were calm under fire, who communicated clearly, who acknowledged difficulty without catastrophizing it, who treated their soldiers as capable adults while also caring for them as human beings, produced units that performed better and whose members showed more resilience across the course of a deployment. The behavioral health programs that the military developed over the course of the Afghanistan war, embedding mental health professionals at the battalion level, reducing the stigma around seeking mental health support, creating formal programs for peer support, all of these were responses to hard lessons learned in places exactly like these remote fire bases. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq changed the American military's understanding of combat stress in fundamental ways that will shape how the institution prepares and cares for its people for generations to come. The soldiers who paid the highest price in terms of psychological injury to generate those lessons deserve to have that acknowledged clearly and directly. They did not struggle because they were weak. They struggled because they were human beings put in conditions that would strain any human being, and the care they received did not always match what they had given. Let us talk about communication. Because one of the most significant differences between the fire base experience of earlier wars and the fire base experience of Afghanistan was the existence of satellite communications technology that allowed soldiers to maintain some form of contact with home throughout their deployment. The Vietnam-era soldier wrote letters and waited weeks for replies. The Afghanistan-era soldier could, on a good day with available bandwidth, video call his family from a laptop in a plywood structure at altitude in a combat zone. The access was intermittent and the bandwidth was often terrible, but the possibility was there, and the possibility changed things. It changed them in ways that were mostly good and in some ways complicated. The ability to hear your wife's voice or see your child's face when you are thousands of miles away, and the distance is measured in more than miles, can be an anchor. It can remind you in the most immediate and personal way why the mission matters, why you signed up, what you are protecting. It can also, in the moments immediately after the call ends and you put down the device and look around at the sandbags and the wire and the mountains, make the distance feel more acute than silence ever could. The soldiers who managed this transition well, who could move from a video call with their family back into the operational mindset without disruption, were exercising a kind of emotional discipline that is rarely discussed, but that was one of the functional demands of the modern combat deployment. The morale calls, as they were known in the formal supply system, were allocated based on available communications infrastructure, but soldiers who had personal smartphones or laptops and access to the base's satellite internet, when that access was available, supplemented the official system with personal communications that were far more frequent. This access was not uniform. The most remote outposts often had the worst communications infrastructure. Ironically, the soldiers in the most dangerous and isolated positions were sometimes the ones with the least reliable contact with home. The military worked throughout the war to improve this disparity, but terrain, operational security concerns, and simple infrastructure limitations meant it was never fully resolved. The rotation of forces through fire bases had its own rhythms and its own particular stresses. Individual soldiers deployed on a standard rotation of 12 months, though at various points during the war the Army extended standard tour to 15 months to meet operational demands. A soldier spent his entire deployment period in theater, but the majority of that time might be spent at a single fire base or rotated between a small number of positions in the unit's area of operations. The return home at the end of the deployment was a transition that required its own kind of management. The human nervous system adapted over months to a state of continuous threat awareness.